Hello everyone, this is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Stay tuned. Today we have a special guest and we will be talking about how to improve your collection of W-9s, and also we'll be talking about that new IRS form, the 1099 NEC. And you'll want to stick around to the end where you as a listener will have unique savings with W-9 managers. Coming right up. Today, we have a special guest on the Putting the AP in Happy podcast. We have John Croyle. John is an MBA and a CPA, and he is also the founder of Rockwater Technology. Now, Rockwater Technology has developed a software tool called W-9 Manager, and we want to hear all about it today, as well as about the 1099 NEC. Yes, you heard it, folks, a new IRS 1099 form. So without further ado, let's welcome John. And John, if you could just start off and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me on the podcast today, Deborah. Appreciate it. And look forward to sharing some of the knowledge I've gained around the W-9 and 1099 process to your listeners. So very excited to be here and talk with you about this important topic. So a little bit about myself. I'd be happy to talk about that. I have a degree in finance and got my CPA when I started in audit with a Fortune 500 company called the Williams Companies, and I was with them for a couple years, and then I transitioned to Enterprise Rent-A-Car, where I worked with them for 16 years as a controller, and the last place that I was at with them was a $200 million region. So it was a good place to learn about managing the accounts payable system, as well as managing vendors in the W-9 and 1099 process. So while I was at Enterprise, I also got my MBA in finance. So there's a short history about me. I did work for a couple other companies after Enterprise, both private equity-owned companies. One was in the technology space, and the other one in the trade show space. So learned, again, in each one of those instances, we used different ERPs, different accounting systems, and had different processes, but always ran into the same type of issues, both good and bad, around the W-9 and 1099 process.
Okay, great. So like me, you were an AP practitioner, and so you felt all the issues that our listeners are going through. So tell us about W-9 Manager and where that idea came from.
Well, sure. I'd be happy to tell you a little bit about that. So it really started when I was working at Enterprise Rent-A-Car. We had a lot of vendors because we had 50 different locations, and each location has different needs, different vendors, different suppliers. We had independent contractors, and so it seemed like no matter how hard we would try throughout the year to get a W-9 on file for every vendor, every payment made. For instance, you could get a W-9 throughout the year, but at the end of the year, you may be missing a name on line one. You may not have the LLC classification in. It may not be signed. There were numerous types of problems that we would walk through in dealing with the W-9 process. So we would, spend, a couple weeks, sending out letters, and then we'd send out emails, and we'd make calls, trying to get all the W-9 information in so that we could then determine who's reportable or not. So that was always kind of a frustration point. I often thought to myself, why is there not something, more like a TurboTax or a DocuSign or something like that helped us manage this process electronically? If that makes sense. Once you get all your W-9s in, then you have to determine, you've got to export all your payments, and you've got to determine who's reportable or not. And, again, with the ERPs that I dealt with, not only at Enterprise, but at the other companies I worked with, there was really never a good system where you could, number one, check off that you actually had a W-9 form on file, include the tax classification, which is important, as you know. A lot of times corporations are exempt in most areas, but in some areas they aren't.
Right.
So that wasn't included in that. And then trying to determine, why we determined them as reportable or not reportable a year ago, and trying to remember, every year, all the, complex rules around 1099s and who's reportable and who's not reportable and which of the 26 W-9 or 1099s it needs to go on. It seemed to me like it was, I never felt really good in the end that we had appropriately handled every payment that we had, caught every payment, made sure that we had done it correctly, we were using information from the prior year. I thought about that and I said, there really ought to be something that takes you from the start to the finish and kind of manages it again, kind of like a TurboTax did for the 1040s. Why can't we have something that takes you from the start of collecting a W-9 all the way through the finish of managing the 1099 process? So, I started to, at that point in time, thinking about, what would that look like, and how would we put that into practice?
That is very interesting because, as you know, and I've been there before too, where trying to collect that W-9 at year end can be frustrating, because by that time you're already dealing with year end and you're trying to get invoices in. And in addition to that, if there are no outstanding invoices or no payments due to the vendors, they typically don't always respond in a timely fashion. So getting that W-9 at the end of the year can be very frustrating. So with that, then W-9 Manager was born, and that sounds very interesting. So how does it work?
Yep, I can, and let me comment on your the points that you just made. One of the issues with not getting W-9 is there's a substantial amount of risk around not getting that W-9, as you are well aware. If you don't get the W-9 in and you can't get it at all, then you're at risk of having to, if you got audited by the IRS, you would be at risk of paying 24% of everything that you paid to that vendor in backup withholding to the IRS. So you pay $100,000 to your vendor, that's $24,000 that you would be responsible to pay to the IRS for not having gotten that W-9. So yes, most of the time that you don't get a W-9 throughout the year, you can likely get it at year end, but there are a lot of instances where you can't get that W-9 at year end. And that becomes a substantial risk. And the 24% is for U.S. payments. For payments to foreign entities and individuals, there's potential of having to pay 30% in required withholding on that. So that's just an important point to know. And then, obviously we know that, things that aren't filed timely can have penalties upwards of $1,100 per 1099 form. So, the IRS has put a lot of weight around this area, and there's a lot of risk. I think a lot more risk than most people understand and appreciate. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in there real quick. So W-9 Manager. So the way that we built W-9 Manager is to manage the process of collecting a W-9 and then determining who's reportable. So you can log into W-9 Manager, create an account, create your company. We actually allow you to create as many companies as you would like to. My last company I worked at, we had 13 different companies, 13 different legal entities, and every one of those we had to manage the payment process and determine who's reportable and issue 1099. So we do allow as many users as you want and as many companies as you want within W-9 Manager. So that's a big benefit. So you can log in, create a company, and then you can send a request. It's pretty easy. You can just key in the name and the email address if you want to request it to, or you can add the full vendor information if you'd like at that point in time. We then send out automatic reminders. So we send an email to your vendor or your independent contractor saying, whatever your company is, Enterprise Rent-A-Car would like to request your W-9 form. And it puts my name, it'd be like John Croyle, my email address, john@w9manager.com, a phone number, and my company. So that vendor or independent contractor knows who's requesting that W-9. And so if they have additional questions, they can reach out to me. Then we send out automatic reminders. So we'll send out 4 reminders over the next 10 working days to help help them remind them to create that W-9. So the vendor can then, or independent contractor can then log into W-9 Manager, and they can walk through our guided step-by-step process to create their W-9 form. And again, our process is not just a PDF. It's actually a process where we walk you through step-by-step, the vendor or independent contractor, on how to complete their W-9 form. And things obviously change on each step depending on what you've put in on the first step. So for instance, if you say that you're an LLC, we would then ask you on the next step, all right, so did you file Form 8832 to request C Corp status from the IRS? Or did you submit Form 2253 to request S Corp status? If they say one or the other, then we'll only give them an EIN number to complete, and we'll walk through it from that point forward. We also have help buttons on almost every question as you walk through it, with additional guidance that the vendor or independent contractor can utilize. So our goal is to help them understand the process, make it easy. We also are looking to make sure that every piece of the form is completed, so that when you get the W-9 back, you're not missing anything on line 1, you're not missing anything, your TIN number's not missing, address is not missing, the signature's not missing, all that information is there. And then your vendor can actually save their W-9, and they can continue to use it for free. They can just log in from their computer or from a cell phone, and they can send that W-9 to anybody for free at that point in time. So once you get the W-9 back, you can then accept the W-9 form, and then we'll walk you through our 1099 matrix, which you basically select the type of payment that you made. So if you made a rent payment to a real estate agent that's managing the rental of your office space, we'll then marry that up to the tax classification on the W-9, and we'll come back and tell you, hey, that's reportable on 1099 MIS, box 1, and then you can know for certain what's reportable, what's not reportable, and know why, which I think is one of the most important things. You made that decision to report them. Yeah.
So this sounds like it helps both the vendor and the buyer, because with the vendor, it's helping the vendor. Once the buyer puts the information into W-9 Manager, the vendor contact info, it gets sent out to the vendor to come in, log in, helps them fill out the W-9, because they don't always know how to fill out the W-9 correctly. So that's a good thing. So it helps them fill out the W-9. It's interactive. And then once that happens, the W-9 is e-signed and it's ready to go. And then on the buyer side, they can then take that W-9 and walk through an interactive process that determines whether or not that vendor is reportable. Did I get that right?
Yep, you got it exactly right. And then at year end, you can export or download a report that lists all your vendors, whether they're reportable or not, what box number they go into, what their tax classification is, what their TIN number is, and also whether they have the ability to opt out of paper 1099s and only receive them electronically, so you can save money by not having to send out a paper 1099 at year end. So you take that list that you export out, and then you just compare that with your vendor payment report out of your ERP, and you almost instantly have a listing of who's reportable and who's not reportable and what box they go into. So that's our goal in the end, is that by January 1st, you have a W-9 on file for every vendor, who's reportable, who's not reportable, what box they go into, and you're basically done with your 1099 process. You just need to take that list and upload it into a 1099 platform and issue those 1099s either through an online service, or you can do it manually yourself as well.
Wow. Where were you when I was a practitioner? That sounds like a great process. And one thing I want to touch on too, now, because this is a web-based tool, does that mean that there's no W-9 and then potentially sensitive personal information in email? Does that mean that all goes away? So if they had a social security number, that W-9 is no longer in email. It's now coming outside of email?
Yes, that's correct. Everything is through a link through the email. And so that's, 256-bit encryption with SSL technology. So it's, it's 100% secure. I guess, I mean, 99% secure, we'll put it that way. But yes, email is the worst way that you can send. Email is always an unsecure way to send your private information and your social security number or EIN. And we never recommend that you do that.
Yeah, and something else that I didn't realize, as these W-9s are being sent, especially in those organizations or companies where the internal team members collect the information from their vendors to send to accounts payable to create the vendor or update the vendor, they're actually, sending that through email, and then they're also keeping that information. So they're storing that W-9 that could have a social security number. They're storing it in email. So that's a scary thing. And it sounds like W-9 Manager gets rid of all of that.
Yep, they're always encrypted and very, very, very difficult to have any issues with. When you receive them through email, there's also issues where people print them out. They're on their desks. They're in their email. They store them in a file cabinet. They store them on an unsecured drive. It takes a lot of work to make sure things are tightly secured. So we do that all for the users.
Well, that sounds great. Now, you have a blog on your website where you talk about W-9 issues, top 5 mistakes made on W-9 forms. You even have a vendor payment compliance guide that can be downloaded. And I actually learned a couple things from there too. So
good.
I did.
That's hard to do with you.
I did. So the first one is I never thought about documenting who we received the W-9 from. And again, possibly because the companies that I've been with, it's come from the internal team member who has gotten it from someone, their contact at the vendor. And then the second piece is encouraging independent contractors and sole proprietors to use an EIN rather than an SSN on their W-9s. Hadn't thought about it that way. The way that that we used to do it was we would require that they submit an EIN, but it wasn't for that reason. It was because we didn't want to have duplicate vendors. So we didn't want to have, a sole proprietor submitting their W-9 on a SSN and then turn around and submit another W-9 with an EIN, and then they'll be in our system twice. But it wasn't for a risk issue. It was because we wanted, well, I guess that is kind of a risk because we don't want duplicate vendors. But this was another reason to do that, was we want to limit our risk because we really don't want to have SSNs in our vendor master file. Is that where you're going with that?
Yep, that's exactly it. Really, it's, obviously from the user, it's helpful if we recommend that because there's less social security numbers that are at risk. But also for the vendor or independent contractor, I think it's very helpful to them to know that they can go out and get an EIN, because they are basically in, quote, business, and they can go get that EIN and use that in their business. So we definitely recommend that and help secure their social security number from their point of view as well. So it works both ways.
And I think it's just not everyone knows, especially those that are new in business, that you don't have to have an employee in order to get an EIN. Now, if you have an employee, you have to get an EIN because now you got to start paying payroll taxes. But you don't need one to get an EIN. And I think the whole process takes like 15 minutes, if that long. And you get the EIN at the end of the process. So it's not something that's hard to do. And I actually really like that recommendation to encourage them to get an EIN rather than send that SSN on the W-9.
And they can do that online too. So we actually have a link when they walk through the W-9 create process. There's actually a link that you can click on, go get your EIN online immediately, come back with that EIN and use it on the W-9 form. So it's pretty slick.
Wow, so you really do take care of the supplier.
We try to put it that way.
That's very good, because that again, you've got some new folks in business out there, independent contractors and sole proprietors. They need all the help that they can get. So W-9 manager walking them through the W-9 and then also giving them a link to get an EIN if they don't have it. That's actually probably saving them a lot of time, and also then better for the buyer because they'll get an accurate W-9 and an EIN versus an SSN.
Yep, you are right.
All right. So I did still want to call attention. You do have a blog where you have quite a few posts about W-9 issues. How often do you publish content?
So I need to do it a little bit more often than I do, but my goal is to get something out on a weekly basis. Although I have not been the best over the last month or two, but we will endeavor to be the best. You know how that is. Creating content takes some time, especially when you're dealing with the tax side of things. It's not just writing an article about SEO. It's, every word means something. So,
and I can understand that too, especially for tax when things are just changing by the minute, it seems like. And you also talk about 1099s on your blog post too. And speaking of new things happening like all the time, we now know that there is a new 1099 NEC that the IRS has come out with for Box 7 recipients. Can you speak to that and any advice you have on changes that are coming?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. So the 1099 NEC is actually a form that used to be used back in 1982, circa 1982, back when Michael Jackson's Thriller album came out, which is crazy how long ago that's been. So, but recently there was it's called the PATH Act, Protecting Americans from Tax Hikes Act, that came out, and it moved the due dates for filing 1099 MIS form forward if it included non-employee compensation in Box 7 to January 31st. So it had previously been February 28th or March 31st. So it was moved up to January 31st, and that has caused some issues with the IRS around, not really around the January 31st deadline, but when late Box 7 1099 forms are filed along with other boxes on the 1099 form, they've had some issues at identifying what penalties should be issued. And so it's caused some issues. So they've decided that they're going to come out and just have this new form called the 1099 NEC. So I should probably talk for 2 seconds about what is non-employee compensation. So, if you make payment to someone who's not your employee, and typically it's services in the course of your trade or business, and it's over $600, that would be something that's reportable. Right now, it's on a 1099 MIS. They are looking, now this is a draft form, so that doesn't mean that it's law yet, but they are put it out for comments, and most of the time when they do that, they are intending to have a new 1099 NEC, unless for some reason there's this giant outcry against it. So we anticipate that they will have a new 1099 NEC come out calendar year 2020, due in January 2021, that they're going to do. So basically what that will mean for organizations is that if you have a vendor that you only pay, or an independent contractor that you only pay for services, then you would just issue them a 1099 NEC, and box 1 of that would be where you would put the information on the amount that you paid them for the year. And that's all you would have to do. However, let's say that maybe your landlord is somebody that also you pay for services for whatever, maybe they did some work on the building or they do some kind of other services, then you would have to potentially report on 2 different forms. You would report their services on the 1099 NEC, and then you would report the rent that you paid to them on the 1099 MIS. So your vendors could potentially get 2 different 1099 forms. And so I think that's going to cause some confusion. And to be proactive about that, again, we've got another year plus until we have to deal with this. But when the 1099 NEC is going to be issued, I would certainly recommend educating your independent contractors and vendors, either in advance with an email about it or with a letter that goes out with a 1099 form or something about that, because most of them are not going to have any idea or have ever seen a 1099 NEC in the past.
Actually, that is good advice, to let your vendors know that they're going to get a different form this year. And I mean, I was a practitioner as recent as last year. And since the IRS moved that due date up for Box 7, we would always file and distribute 1099 MIS for all boxes as of January 31st, because it was just too hard to only do box 7 and then go back and do the rest. And the problem is that it wasn't for us where the 1099 missed box 7 was an issue, but box 1 where we had our rents, that was a big diverse population, and it was those folks who we sent the 1099 on January 31st. We filed with the IRS, and then we had to send a bunch of corrections because those vendors would call back with, a new address because the 1099 didn't make it there, or with corrections to what they were paid. And so we ended up filing a lot of corrections with filing all boxes on January 31st. So I actually kind of like this idea. I will just say to the audience that's listening, if your ERP system or your accounting system has a customized 1099 MISC form, then you need to engage your IT team or whoever it is that can go and either create a new one for the 1099 NEC or recustomize the 1099 MISC, because that box 7 will be removed from there. And so, we've gotten till 2020, and then filing for 2021. It may sound like it's a lot of time, but for those of you who have dealt with your IT departments before and getting your projects in with other capital projects and other priorities, this is the time to do it, to start now and look at what changes may need to go into place in order to process the 1099 NECs out of your accounting systems and ERP. So now's the time. And John, there's not a whole lot of information out about it now. Where can they go to find more information out about the 1099 NEC?
So there's 2 places. One, you can always go to the IRS website and put in draft forms and then search for the 1099 NEC. You'll see their proposed form right now. They do not have any proposed instructions or draft instructions yet. So we'll see those come out sooner than later, I would anticipate. And then there's also in the Federal Register, they always are looking for comments. So if any of your listeners think this could impact them in a significant way and want to submit a formal comment, then they can go to the Federal Register and search for the 1099 NEC, and then they can submit a formal comment for that as well, because that's kind of what the IRS is looking for right now. They are saying, hey, here's our proposal. What do you all think about this? And please give us comments back. And there's time right now to make those comments if they affect any of your listeners in a significant way.
But there's no chance where the 1099 NEC is not going to go into effect. I mean, I know it's just a draft form now, so it may be revised by the time the final comes out, but it is a form that the IRS at some point will publish, correct?
Correct. Well, we don't know until they actually do it, but it's highly likely. The IRS generally doesn't release draft forms, until they believe that they have all the needed updates have been incorporated, and there may be some unexpected issues or legislation that gets passed between now and then, but in general they've kind of made up their mind and this is what they want to do. But hopefully you would think that they would be open to comments. Now, I do know a couple years back they were intending to have all payments to corporations be reportable on a 1099, and there was a huge uproar about that and the cost of managing that reporting liability, or the cost of reporting of that, and that was reversed. So there are times that the IRS does reverse its proposals from the comments that are made, but it is rare.
Does that mean that you're preparing for the 1099 NEC in W-9 Manager? So as that W-9 from the supplier comes back or from the vendor comes back, and then W-9 will take the buyer through the steps to determine if it's reportable. Does that 1099 NEC work its way into W-9 Manager in 2020, 2021?
Yes, actually, it would likely be at the beginning of 2020, because that's when the new laws start. So we would then recommend, we would say, if you select that you've made a payment of services to a certain individual, then we would say this would be reportable on 1099 NEC Box 1. And if you said, hey, I made a payment of royalties to a vendor or whatnot, then we would say that's reportable in Box 2 on 1099 miss. So it will definitely impact the guidance that we give our users on what 1099 is going to be reportable on. And I think this is going to, I anticipate this impacting almost every company, to be honest, because, every company makes payments of rent or, other payments other than just box 7 payments.
Right.
I very rarely have seen a company not only be making, unless you're super small, only making box 7 NEC payments to vendors or independent contractors that do service work.
I haven't seen a company, well, at least not any that I've worked at in the past, where we have only reported box 7. There's always been rents, there's always been settlements. So we're box 3, box 14 for attorneys. And so it's always been, in my case at least, where we're reporting on more than just box 7. But it's good, though, that W-9 Manager is keeping up with the IRS trends and new forms and getting it in there. So again, that's another value add for using a tool like W-9 Manager. So at least if you or your staff don't quite understand it yet, W-9 will have you covered. Did I say that right?
That's right.
It is going to be confusing.
It's right. Well, our goal is, I've always thought, maybe you should get your take on this. I've always thought that the 1099, actually uploading your process into a 1099, online 1099 company, or issuing the 1099 forms, that's the easy part. The hard part for me has always been to get a W-9 from every vendor and get the list together and who's reportable and who's not, what box they go into. So it's always been my goal with W-9 managers to make, take the hardest part of the process and make it super easy. Again, so that on January 1st, you are ready to go. You've basically got your work done, and all you have to do is that easy part, which is just to send out the 1099s either online or by paper.
Yeah. And, I think you're absolutely right about that, because determining, who's reportable, that was like several iterations. And then finally printing, not that wasn't a big chore too, because my last position, I think we had 24,000 1099s. And I don't know.
It's a few more than I've dealt with. Holy cow. 24,000.
And I don't know why we were still doing that in-house, but we were. And so it was a process. And so 1099 NEC, not quite sure how that's going to be handled back then. But again, if I were still there, my first thing, and I would, caution the listeners and the audience that if you know that you have a configured process for W-9s in your accounting or ERP system, even though we don't have a final form of the 1099 NEC, get that project on your IT's project list, so at least there's awareness that it's coming. That would be my first step, and then we would just go from there. But I see why the IRS is doing it, and I think it may be beneficial. It's just going to be a couple years of rockiness, and something like W-9 Manager may help in guiding through those first couple of years when we're using that 1099 NEC.
I agree.
So this has been a great conversation, and I want to make sure that the audience knows where to go to get more information on W-9 Manager, all the great info you have on W-9s, and keep up with, what's going on with the 1099 NEC. So where can our listeners get more info?
Sure. You just visit our website at W9 and then manager.com. So it's super easy, W9manager.com. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions for folks. So if they want to email me, they can email me as well at john@W9manager.com, and be happy to, at least for your listeners specifically, they can always email me with additional questions about that.
Perfect. So thanks, John. I appreciate you coming on today, and hopefully we will get to know some more information about the 1099 NEC, and when that is final, maybe we'll bring you back on to talk through the final forms.
That would be great, Deborah. I appreciate you having me on as well, and all the great information you've given us as well today. So thank you very much.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for staying on, and as promised, just for listening to the Putting the AP in Happy podcast today, you will receive 10% off W-9 Manager using discount code HAPPY19. Use that at www.w9manager.com. So thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 44th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.